Alright, my friends, we have learned about a lot of very important, influential people so far. We have talked about Susan B. Anthony, who fought for women's suffrage, or the right for women to vote. We talked about Eleanor Roosevelt, who fought for human and civil rights for everyone. We talked about Mary McLeod Bethune, who fought for educational rights for African American girls. And Jackie Robinson, who fought to break down color barriers in professional sports. And in our last lesson, we talked about Rosa Parks, who stood up for the rights of African American people during the Civil Rights Movement. Today we are going to talk about one of the most important people that was part of the Civil Rights Movement. In fact, he was so important and so influential that in America today, we have a special day set aside to honor him. That man is Martin Luther King Jr. Now remember, we talked about the Civil War, and we talked about how the end of the Civil War brought the end of slavery, but it didn't bring a perfect life for African American people. African American people were still treated terribly in the United States, and they did not have the same rights that white people had. Martin Luther King Jr. worked with other members that were part of the Civil Rights Movement to help change that, to bring equal rights for everyone, regardless of the color of their skin. We'll talk a little bit more about how he did that after we go over our vocabulary words.
Activists. Activists are people who take some kind of action to achieve a goal. Susan B. Anthony led a determined group of women's rights activists. Minister. A minister is a person who works for a church and performs religious functions and duties. The minister continues to inspire the members of her church. Sit-ins. Sit-ins were nonviolent protests that involve a person or people sitting down in specific locations and refusing to move. As part of the Civil Rights Movement, many people participated in organized sit-ins. Character. Character is the qualities or traits that make up a person. Lucy is so honest that cheating could never be part of her character. Extraordinary. Extraordinary means that someone or something is incredible or out of the ordinary. The first moon landing was an extraordinary moment in history. Extraordinary is an adjective because it is used to describe nouns or people, places, or things. Extraordinary is a word that has been created by joining two separate words together, extra and ordinary. The word extra means something additional or something that has been added on, and the word ordinary means something that is regular or not unusual. When these two words are combined, they create a new word with a new meaning. Words like this are called compound words. Compound words are written as just one word. So extraordinary means special or incredible, but it is combined using the words extra, meaning added on, and ordinary, meaning usual. Banned. Banned means stopped or kept something or someone out. Unfair laws were banned in the United States. As a young African American boy growing up in the South, Martin Luther King Jr. witnessed and experienced discrimination. Martin knew that it was unfair, and it made him sad. As a young boy, he could not have known that he would grow up to become one of the most famous and respected civil rights activists and leaders in American history. In his short life, he would challenge discrimination and change laws and attitudes. He would bring people of all races together and this nation would become a better place because of him. Martin was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. Martin had an older sister, Willie Christine, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel. He lived in a loving home with his parents, his brother and sister, and his grandparents. Martin's father, Martin King Luther Sr., was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Martin was a member of his father's church. Just like Rosa Parks, Jackie Robinson, and Mary Bethune, Martin was born during a time when African American people in the United States did not have equal rights. Segregation kept people apart and prevented African Americans from being full and equal members of society. Remember, segregation was the separation of people based on the color of their skin. Martin was a very bright boy. He began attending school when he was 5 years old. He was a student at Oglethorpe Elementary School. After elementary school, Martin attended Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta. Because he was such a good student, Martin skipped 2 grades. At just 15 years of age, Martin became a student at Morehouse College. Students usually start college at age 17 or 18, so Martin was very young to be a college student. At first, Martin considered becoming a doctor or a lawyer, but he later changed his mind and decided to become a minister like his father and grandfather before him. After graduating from Morehouse, Martin attended Crozer Theological Seminary. There, his studies prepared him for his work as a minister. Martin completed his education at Boston University. He received his doctorate when he was just 25 years old. A doctorate is the highest academic honor or degree awarded to a student. When someone receives a doctorate, they are called doctor. Martin was known as Dr. King. Martin had not only gained a doctorate in Boston, he had also gained a wife, a beautiful young lady named Coretta Scott. Coretta had been studying music at the New England Conservatory in Boston. Upon Martin receiving his doctorate, he and Coretta moved to Montgomery, Alabama, where he became the minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Martin was now ready to begin the career he had prepared for. As a young teenager riding city buses in the South, Martin had experienced the same discrimination that Rosa Parks had experienced. African Americans had to sit at the back of the bus, and if the bus was full, the driver would ask a person of color to stand up so that a white person could sit down. Martin thought that this was humiliating, and so, as well as being a pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, Martin decided that he would become a civil rights activist. When Rosa Parks challenged racial segregation in the Montgomery city bus system and a bus boycott began, Martin was asked to be the leader of this movement. The African American community stood together under his leadership. They refused to ride the buses until they were able to choose a seat freely. The boycott lasted more than a year. People walked, rode bicycles, and rode in carpools to get to work. Martin led the boycott. Martin and his fellow activists were threatened and intimidated, but they did not back down. Finally, the United States Supreme Court, the most powerful court in the country, ruled that bus segregation was illegal and had to stop. At that moment, Martin became one of the most important people in the American Civil Rights Movement. In fact, Martin became its leader. Martin was prepared to be the leader of the Civil Rights Movement, even though he knew he was putting himself and his family in danger. There were many people who did not like the changes he and his fellow activists wanted. For his part, despite the dangers, he insisted that those involved in the civil rights movement remain peaceful and never use force. What's the word that we learned about in our very first read aloud of this domain that refers to peaceful response to unfair treatment? You've got it, nonviolence. Martin believed that an organized, nonviolent movement that protested against inequality with thoughtful words and not with fists or guns would succeed. He greatly admired others who used nonviolence to protest. Martin and 60 other ministers and activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was an excellent way to organize members of African American churches throughout the country. They all worked together to try to bring about social changes that would improve the lives of all Americans. They also set out to register African Americans in the South to vote, so that they could use the power of their vote to bring about change. In his first speech to this group, Martin said, "We have no alternative but to protest. For many years, we have shown an amazing patience. We have sometimes given our white brothers the feeling that we liked the way we were being treated. But we come here tonight to be saved from that patience that makes us patient with anything less than freedom and justice." And so it began. African Americans living in southern states where segregation was legal began to protest. Young African American students began to hold sit-ins at lunch counters that would not serve them. Remember, sit-ins were nonviolent protests that involved people sitting down in specific locations. Here we see them sitting at a lunch counter. Such counters were common in restaurants during the 50s and 60s when the civil rights movement took place. Many people of different races supported the civil rights movement. People rode buses from state to state and protested in places that practiced segregation. Over and over again, they sat in at lunch counters, waiting rooms, and college campuses. Many people were arrested for taking part in these peaceful protests. Martin and his family moved to Atlanta, where he worked with his father at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Both Martin's father and grandfather were ministers who had, during their lifetimes, worked for equal rights for African Americans. The civil rights movement kept going. Martin and others continued to demonstrate peacefully and to lead marches. During one demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, Martin was sent to jail. There he wrote his famous letter from the Birmingham jail. In this letter, he explained that it was his view that whereas just or fair laws must be obeyed, unjust or unfair laws, such as segregation laws, must be ignored. The following year, Martin led a march on Washington, D.C. to pressure the government into changing segregation laws in southern states. More than 200,000 people walked from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. There, in front of the memorial, Martin delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He said that he hoped for a day when people would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Later, Martin was given one of the highest awards anyone can achieve, the Nobel Peace Prize. With this award came $54,000 in prize money, which he donated to a number of civil rights groups. Martin often felt threatened. He often feared for his own safety and that of his family. In his lifetime, Martin was jailed 30 times. But he was a peaceful warrior who fought with words. Sadly, in 1968, this courageous man was killed. This terrible tragedy happened in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin had gone to that city to support workers who were not being treated fairly. Martin seemed to have had a feeling that he would not live to see the changes he so wanted. The night before he died, Martin told a crowd gathered to hear him speak, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." Because of Martin Luther King Jr. and those people involved in the civil rights movement, a law was passed called the Civil Rights Act, which banned segregation. This was followed by a law called the Voting Rights Act, which removed any restrictions on the right to vote for African Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. had led the way for a better, brighter future for all people. Almost 20 years after his death, the United States Congress decided the third Monday in January would become a federal holiday in Martin's honor. On this day, we remember this extraordinary man for all that he achieved. This day is now celebrated as a national day of service where all people are encouraged to find ways to help others, just as Martin did during his lifetime. There is also a monument not far from the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., from which Martin delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. It opened to the public in August 2011. It is the first monument on the mall to honor an African American. The young boy who experienced discrimination grew up to become a national hero.
Martin Luther King Jr. was an incredible man who worked a lot for the civil rights movement. What are some of the ways that he worked for the civil rights movement? What sort of things did he do? We talked about a lot of things he did. He found a lot of non-violent ways to protest. He protested, he attended protests, he marched, he gave speeches, and he even let himself go to jail for that peaceful demonstration. What did Martin do after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus? If you remember from our last lesson, and from this one, after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat for a white man, Martin Luther King Jr. helped organize the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So he organized people refusing to ride the buses in a show of protest. Did Martin believe in fighting peacefully for equal rights, or did he believe in fighting or using violence? That question's a piece of cake. That's an easy one, huh? He believed in fighting peacefully. What are some adjectives that you would use to describe Martin Luther King Jr. and the kind of person that he was? We talked about his famous speech, his "I Have a Dream" speech today. How would you explain to your family or friends the meaning of the words of that speech? What was he trying to accomplish by giving that speech? In that speech, one of my favorite lines that I always remember is when he said that he wanted people to be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. That means he thinks that people should be judged based on who they are and what kind of person they are, not what they look like. I want you to turn to whoever is helping you today and talk about this next one with them for just a few minutes. Do you think that Martin Luther King's Sorry, friends, let's try that again. Do you think that Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of people being judged by the content of their character rather than by the color of their skin has come true? Why or why not? Go ahead and pause this video while you talk about that one for a minute. When you are ready, go ahead and open up the PDF that is attached to this assignment. We will get started on our free verse poem about Martin Luther King Jr. I am also going to add Martin Luther King Jr. to our timeline. So he worked around the same time as Rosa Parks. We're going to put him just slightly after her, because one of the main things that we talked about today was him organizing the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which happened, of course, after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Alright, my friends. I'm going to jump over to my computer so we can talk about that free verse poem a little more.
Go ahead and open up those PDFs that are attached to this assignment. I have got mine opened up already, and I've already turned it on its side to make it a little bit easier for me to write on. Today, our free verse poem is going to be about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We learned a lot about this incredible man today, so there are lots of different things that we could put in our bubbles. To start with, let's talk about the cause that Martin Luther King Jr. fought for. He was a civil rights activist. So remember, the civil rights movement was a series of actions that fought for civil rights, equal rights for everyone, regardless of skin color. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted African American people in America to be treated fairly. Do you remember what Martin Luther King Jr. did for his regular job? We talked about how when he went to college, he thought about being a doctor or a lawyer. Eventually, he decided he wanted to be a minister. A minister is a religious leader. He was a religious leader in a Baptist church, just like his father and his grandfather before him. Martin Luther King Jr. was a powerful speaker. He was very good at giving speeches, and that's what he was known for. One of his most famous speeches is what we call his I Have a Dream speech. Through his words, Martin Luther King Jr. was able to help change people's ideas through his words and his actions. He believed very strongly in nonviolence and protesting with nonviolence. He thought that it was better to use his words than his fists or weapons to protest and make change. He gave lots of speeches, he organized marches, and he helped organize sit-ins and the boycott of the Montgomery city buses. Martin Luther King Jr. was a very brave man. Stand up and fight for what he believed in. I want you to see if you can fill out the rest of those bubbles on your own. If you've got different ideas that you want to put in your bubbles, different than the ones that I put in mine, that's okay. Your bubble map does not have to look exactly the same as mine. Yours can look however you would like it to. When you are finished with your bubbles, we'll move on to our poem. I'm going to turn my paper back and scroll to this page. On this page, we have got a picture of the Lincoln Memorial, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, and a picture of the man himself. Remember, our titles for our poems, you can choose a different title, but if you're having a hard time thinking up a title, the name of the subject of the poem is a good idea for a title. Remember, in a free verse poem, the words do not have to rhyme. They do not have, there's not a specific pattern you have to follow. There is not a specific number of syllables or words that have to be in each line. And you do not have to write in complete sentences all the time. You can use complete sentences, but you can also use words and phrases to express your opinion about Martin Luther King Jr. Go ahead and use your bubble map and the ideas you generated there to write a free verse poem about Martin Luther King Jr. When you are finished with your poem, go ahead and turn this page in, and you are all finished with knowledge today.